Hello, everyone. This is Real Crusades history. First of all, I'd like to say thanks very much to everybody who's been watching and commenting and sending me messages. It's extremely encouraging and exciting to know that there are so many people out there who really are interested in not only just medieval history, but the history of the Crusades. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, like the Facebook page, because that's where I do all the regular updates. And if you can, share these videos with people you know who might be interested in the Crusades, or more importantly, might have some misconceptions about the Crusades. So anyway, so by far the most common question that I get is, hey, I'm interested in the Crusades, and I really don't know where to start. I want to know what are some good books to kind of get me started on understanding the Crusades. And I get this question so often that I really just feel like I want to just make a little video at this point that I can kind of just share with people who have this interest and who want to really get going with some reading on this subject. Obviously, there's just a huge spectrum of literature available about the Crusades. In terms of scholarly literature that's coming out, it's most of it is outstanding. There's never been a time in history when there's been better scholarship about the Crusades. The problem is when you get unscholarly stuff, stuff written by people like Karen Armstrong, a lot of the documentaries that are coming out, that kind of thing. These are kind of vehicles for political agendas for nowadays. And they tend to mainly just sort of promote a lot of the old myths and inaccuracies about the Crusades that have long been debunked but are still kind of going around. So you really have to go to the scholarly world, the world of historians, to get an accurate picture of the Crusades. And like I said, it's just an exciting time for scholarship. There's just amazing scholars everywhere doing some amazing work, and we really have never understood the Crusades better, in the modern era, than we do right now. Book number 1. What Were the Crusades? By Jonathan Riley Smith. This book is absolutely outstanding. It's small. It's almost more like a long essay. It's 114 pages, including the index. And Riley Smith, as a lot of you probably know, is really he's kind of the leading authority on the Crusades, period, who's alive right now still. And he's just a massive scholar. And he's done a lot of work to kind of debunk a lot of the old myths. He's done some of the most exhaustive research. And he wrote this little book as basically kind of a short introduction to the subject for his students. And what it kind of effectively does is it gives an accurate overview of what the Crusades really constitute, and it kind of turns over a lot of the old myths, like, say, the Crusades were about money, they were proto-colonialism, the Crusades only happened in the Holy Land, that kind of thing. So it's so short, there's really no reason not to get and read this book. And I would say it's really the first place to start. If you haven't read anything yet, just pick up this book, read that, and that's going to get you going. So the next thing we have is Thomas Madden, The New Concise History of the Crusades. Now, again, this is a pretty short book. It's considerably longer than the Riley Smith one, which is just tiny. But again, this is an overview book, and it's new, and it's recent, and so it takes advantage of the best scholarship. Thomas Madden is probably the leading scholar on the Crusades in the United States right now. And actually, I emailed Jonathan Riley Smith once, and he actually told me that he considered Thomas Madden to be the guy to go to if you had questions about the Crusades and you live in the U.S. He's at St. Louis University. This book, it's fairly chronological. It goes into some detail about the larger aspect of the Crusades outside of the Holy Land, but it really does kind of focus on the Holy Land. So it does kind of focus on that traditional period of 1095 to 1291, where these operations took place in Palestine and Syria. But it gives a very accurate kind of representation of what scholars now understand about that. So this would really be a good book to go to next. And thirdly, we've got, this is a huge book. So we went from some short books to a very large volume. This is God's War by Christopher Tyerman. And I consider this to be the definitive single volume about the Crusades. My copy of it is just absolutely brutalized because I've used it so much. Christopher Tyerman is an intellectual giant. His understanding of this subject and his research is just exhaustive. He wrote this book kind of as a sort of almost a revision to Stephen Runciman's, completely debunked history of the Crusades. And he claims that that's not what he's doing, but I think it's pretty obvious that's what he is doing. And what he's done here is he has expanded that traditional narrative to include the whole scope of crusading as it was understood in the Middle Ages. Because medieval people understood very well that the Crusades in the Holy Land were equivalent to the Crusades in the Baltic and Spain and Italy, and then later the Crusades against the Ottomans and even the Albigensian Crusade and all of that. A crusade was a war that had been granted an indulgence by the papacy. This book, one of the things I love about it is that Tyerman, first of all, he goes through all of the major events in fairly broad detail. The First Crusade, the Second Crusade, the Third Crusade, all the major kind of crusades to the Holy Land that the Victorians numbered. And he also goes into pretty good detail about the Reconquista, the Crusades in Spain, the Baltic Crusades. He talks about the later Crusades, too. He discusses Lepanto in detail. And throughout all of this, he really challenges and revisits a lot of the assumptions and cliches surrounding these different expeditions. And just as an example, when he's talking about the Second Crusade, he discusses there's a lot of cliches and sort of myths surrounding the Second Crusade about why it failed. There's all these explanations given. He discusses Louis VII's decision to campaign in Damascus rather than Antioch. A lot of people say, oh, well, he did that because he was jealous of Prince Raymond of Antioch because he was hanging out with his wife a lot, Queen Eleanor. But Tyerman actually re-examines that and says, well, it actually probably more was for strategic reasons and that kind of thing. He goes into detail about Raynald of Chatillon, about how, a lot of the myths surrounding him, the idea that he was somehow kind of a renegade in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, when in reality he was pretty much a supporter of King Baldwin IV, and the two of them had a pretty consistent policy in terms of their stance of aggression against the Muslims. And he's extremely objective. He doesn't demonize either the Christians or the Muslims. He doesn't lionize them either. He points out atrocities where they occurred, but he also doesn't judge them by modern standards. He kind of puts them in their medieval context. So this book is huge. It takes a while to read, but this is the place to go if you really want to kind of get a thorough overview of the Crusades, and I highly recommend it. I think if you haven't read it yet, you probably are missing out on a lot. So next we've got another one by Jonathan Riley Smith, and this is getting into a little bit closer detail of a specific aspect of the Crusades. This is called The First Crusaders, 1095 to 1131. And even though, this is a specific aspect of crusading, it does focus on the First Crusade and the early Crusade era in the Levant, which, no question, that is where the larger Crusade movement came from. But what it does is Riley Smith did something kind of revolutionary with the research in this book. He used computer databases to basically to kind of organize all this information from charters issued for the First Crusade to kind of get some statistics and perspective on why people were going, because you have all these charters describing all these people who went on the First Crusade and their reasons, and he was able to debunk a lot of the myths, like, for example, the idea that only younger sons went, that people went because they were seeking plunder, that people were trying to get rich. The First Crusade cost people a lot of money. He also goes into some of the sociological aspects of the Crusade that contributed to the existence of the movement. In particular, he talks about women and how noble women had a big impact on the Crusades movement. They appeared to be the ones who were involved in spreading the message of crusade, especially through their chaplains. Like, this is kind of a common phenomenon in religion, especially Christianity, is that women, these noble women would have chaplains, and they'd be very interested in the teaching of these particular chaplains. So these women would interact with the clergy and be discussing this stuff with the clergy. And the clergy at this time, a lot of them were interested in this crusade idea that Urban II was spreading around. And so the women, through that, were able to kind of spread this to the various families that they had contact with. And of course, a medieval noblewoman is going to have strong connections with more than just her husband's family. She's going to have strong connections with the family of her father as well. And so this is kind of the pattern that Jonathan Riley Smith notices in how crusading enthusiasm spreads. So this book, another thing that's fascinating about it too, is that he has this list he has created of all these men who went on the First Crusade, and it's a huge list. And so it's like you really get the feeling that Riley Smith was getting kind of at the heart of this expedition, and really kind of getting a picture of even just who was on this expedition, like down to a list of each of their names and who they were. It's not just a faceless mass of people anymore. You're getting like the specific men and why they went. So this is kind of an indispensable book in my opinion, and one that is well worth the read. So now we're getting into primary sources. And again, this one focuses on the First Crusade, which, again, because this is how the crusading movement started, I think that's appropriate. This is the Chronicle of Fulcher of Chartres and other source materials, edited with an introduction by Edward Peters. Now, this is kind of a classic volume in the world of Crusades education. I'm sure lots of classes have used this book. And what it is, it's a collection of primary sources associated with the First Crusade, not in their full forms. It's excerpts and selections. And it starts with Fulcher of Chartres. Now, Fulcher of Chartres, of course, was a French priest who participated in the First Crusade. He was the chaplain of King Baldwin I of Jerusalem. And he documented the First Crusade. He wrote a history of it, and his account of the actual crusade is contained in this volume. But also you've got excerpts from the Gesta Francorum, which is the anonymous chronicle of the First Crusade. Anna Comnena, Raymond of Toulouse, his chaplain, wrote a history of the First Crusade. There's excerpts of that in here. There's also, in the newer editions, excerpts from Muslim authors like Ibn al-Athir and Ibn al-Qalanisi. And he's also got Albert of Aachen and some sources like that. And then finally, he's got letters. He's got letters from Count Stephen II of Blois and Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse and some of the bishops. So that's in here, and that's absolutely fascinating stuff. So this is kind of a way of getting introduced to the world of primary sources. Once you read this book, you're probably going to want to seek out some of the full versions of these sources. And I think that's kind of the point of this book. So next we've got something else that's kind of specific to a particular area of Crusades history. That's Reconquest and Crusade in medieval Spain. Now, why just a book that focuses on Spain? Well, Spain was a huge part of the Crusades. I mean, no question. It may even be the longest running theater of Crusade operations. Really, you've got Crusades going on in Spain from the 12th century into when Isabel and Fernando took Granada at the end of the 15th century. And this book is an overview of that. And it mainly focuses on the High Middle Ages. But I think that this is important because we really need to establish that Spain was a theater of crusading. And that kind of helps people to understand how successful the Crusade movement really was. The Crusade movement transformed Europe with this idea. And Spain was just like the Holy Land. It was a place that emphasized this war to drive out Islam. And people came from all over Europe to participate in the Crusades in Spain, just like they did in the Holy Land. Joseph O'Callaghan is an expert on medieval Spain. He has a book, actually, that's just a history of medieval Spain. and he's really a top scholar in this field, and he uses, a whole plethora of primary sources for this book, and it's just really a good overview of this whole phenomena of crusades in Spain. And he kind of helps to reconcile this concept of reconquest and crusading, because they are kind of two specific things. On the one hand, you've got the Christians of Spain. They just, because of nationalistic reasons, if you can use that term in the Middle Ages, wanted to retake their territory from the Muslims. But also there was a spiritual element to it, and that's what drew participants from all over Europe. So this is a book that's pretty essential, and I think that it should be on your reading list of initial books that you're going to use to get yourself familiar with the Crusades. Okay, so last, we've got The Northern Crusades by Christiansen. Now again, this is a book that kind of focuses on something specific, but something huge in the history of crusading, and that's one of the main theaters, which is the Baltic. Now again, these campaigns were really seen in the same way that the Crusades in the Holy Land were seen in the Middle Ages, and that was these were wars called by the Pope, sanctioned by the Pope, and in which you could merit indulgences, time remitted off of your purgatory and remission of your sins to participate in these wars. And of course, a lot of Germans participated in the Baltic conquest, and the Teutonic Knights, of course, who were an order of military monks similar to the Knights Templar, were heavily involved in the Northern Crusades. So this is a book that is going to introduce you to this huge aspect of crusading, and it's going to help you understand how this fits into the larger narrative of crusading. Christiansen is the authority on this subject, and it's a pretty hefty work in terms of its scope. It really covers the entire history of this thing, which starts in the 12th century and goes into the really the late Middle Ages and even into the kind of pre-modern world to an extent. But for the most part, it kind of the big thrust of the Northern Crusades was in the 13th century. So this is going to be a book that's also going to incorporate a broader understanding of the Crusades into your worldview on this. So I highly recommend The Northern Crusades by Christiansen. Okay, so that's it. That's my list of books. I think that hopefully that'll keep a lot of people busy for a while. So thanks very much.